All right, welcome to ConCon, Consciousness Conversations, where we talk about all things related to consciousness, neuroscience, artificial intelligence. I'm DR.
And I'm Ben. And DR, where are you right now?
I'm coming live from, well, I guess not live when you hear this, from Tucson, Arizona. I'm at the 30th anniversary, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned this previously. This is the 30th anniversary of the Science of Consciousness Conference. So
Wow.
Our podcast really started last year as a run-up to this conference that Ben and I were attending, where we wanted to kind of talk about some of our theories about consciousness, some of the ideas that we like, and then we did these episodes from each day. And so even though Ben's remote, we're kind of continuing that, and it'll be a little bit more of me explaining to Ben some of the things I've heard, which who knows, maybe that'll be a little bit easier for people to follow if I'm having to catch you up. But yeah, so. Let's start with. I'm going to show.
That 30 years puts things in perspective. I'm thinking about Stuart Hemroff who runs it. Was he there in the very
Oh
first
yeah, he
one?
started it. Him and
So he was
it's like
probably a
he
young
and
man,
Penrose's little
right?
baby. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Wow. Interesting.
yeah. I would say based on the demographics of there are some young consciousness people here now. I would say you got a couple people that are in their late 20s, early 30s, but you have a huge glut of people who I think were interested in this, got sidetracked into something else, and now are back.
Do you ever get the feeling, especially when you talk to like these older guys who have posters, do they ever seem like disillusioned or despondent that I mean, I'm just trying to put myself in Stuart Hameroff's shoes. Like 30
Yeah.
years ago, he was probably like, yeah, we're right on the precipice. We're going to figure this out, this consciousness thing. And here we are 30 years later, and it's still just bitter arguments. At some point, you have
Yeah,
to get a little jaded, I would think, but maybe not for this type of person.
it's interesting. I think that so I was telling Ben I've run into a couple of these folks who are retired, maybe from tech, engineering, whatever. This is one of the posters I got. This guy gave me his handout today. You want to read it, Ben? What does it say?
The existence framework from some spiritual center. How does consciousness decipher the brain's neural circuitry?
So this one's about he was
Consciousness.
telling me about these things called existrons, conscious quanta that emerge from the voids and then combine to form photons. I feel like there's people that like what consciousness is for people is the ultimate explanation of everything. So I think that whatever the relevant everything is to you is what consciousness ends up being for people, and they can't kind of help themselves from diving into like trying to pull in everything. And I feel that energy too, right? I feel that
I
like
mean, I'm certainly never going to give up. Yeah, I guess that's well put because it's not the type of thing where, it's not like a math problem. You work on it for a while and you get a little disillusioned. You're like, maybe I can't figure it out. This is kind of like one of the ultimate questions. It's worth sort of pursuing, I suppose, forever.
yeah. All right. Well, let's get into the day. So I have prepared a bunch of images that I've taken of slides and things from the conference. I have some notes as well that I probably won't share because my handwriting is terrible. Yeah, we'll talk through it. So I'll talk about the stuff that I happen to see, and then we'll see how Ben enjoys these
And
hot
for the
topics.
listeners, I guess I'll do my best to describe this.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so we're
You can
looking
also
at, I
watch this
guess,
on YouTube if you're currently listening on another format. Is also
yes,
an option.
we're looking at their beautiful visualization of quantum and classical approaches, visualized as a Pepsi logo.
It's also the Korean
Um,
Airlines logo, and I think there's a few other places that use almost this identical thing. Yeah,
But really, I think it's they're wanting us to think yin and yang. Quantum is yin, classical is yang, or vice versa. I don't know. But consciousness is the dividing line, or the river that runs through it. I'm not sure.
well, and what's interesting is I feel like the quantum as the I don't know. This year, it feels like some of the quote unquote more fringe consciousness theories, if we think of like the default theory as like neurons produce consciousness and that's the end of the story, um, I would say that's becoming a minority view amongst people here, which is interesting. Not that like neurons don't play a part, but that there's like more to the story. Um, and yeah, I'm kind of getting swayed by some of this stuff. So we'll talk more about that, I think, over the course of the next few
It
episodes.
is pretty bold to make your logo have the word quantum in it. Like if I were to look at this, I would say like, I mean, it seems to discount several theories that don't need
Yeah.
quantum effects for to explain consciousness.
Well, and I
Seems
think
almost to disclude those people.
everybody loves quantum because, as a concept, because its spookiness. It's like, oh, we have so it's these two things, right? We've got this observer impact effect where it's like, oh, if I observe an electron going through a slit, then it always goes one way. But if I don't observe it, it goes both ways. You know, there's this kind of spookiness, and the deeper I've gone down the rabbit hole on these observer studies, the more solid that thing is, including it seems like it knows what you were going to decide in the past. There's some really cool videos I've seen about that. But so I think there's this spookiness to it, and people see this spookiness in consciousness, and they're like, same, same, same. And I'll share. I did go to a bit of Stuart Hameroff's session where he talks about anesthesia and quantum effects. And yeah, I don't know. I think that there are some effects there. I just think that probably what we're dealing with is like multi-layered and multifaceted.
Well, I also am wondering, they did a poll last time, which I thought was pretty fun,
Yeah.
where they had all the pet theories and you got to vote. And that was kind of an interesting thing because then you could see, okay, the demographics of this conference. What are they actually? What is the actual popular stuff? And from what I remember, it was something like higher order
The
predictive processing.
social one was number one. Social
Oh, that's what it was.
explanations, right? Which is basically like Graziano attention schema stuff. So
Right. And so that makes me wonder, like, did Hameroff design this in an old version of Adobe Photoshop specifically to counter, like, is he trying to
yeah,
like
yeah,
double down?
100%. Yeah, and I mean he's continued his tactic of every single session that doesn't explicitly mention quantum. Is the first question and talks about it and how it relates. So uh, people seem to be putting up with it. It'll be interesting to see if on Friday when they do this like 30th anniversary panel, if if there's like feedback about how things are going. I don't think it's going to take that tone. And you notice that he neither last time nor this time is he doing a poll here. That was something those Taormina organizers did. All right, so the first session that I went to was about terminal lucidity. And terminal lucidity I had just read about, and I immediately forgot. And I was like, what the hell is that? Is that like you are so lucid that it kills you? No. Terminal lucidity is this long reported phenomenon. So this is a new name that somebody has given to this long reported phenomenon where as people approach end of life, they somehow kind of perk up. This could be somebody who is has dementia or someone who's like not conscious really, and they'll like kind of wake up and engage with people, and very soon after that die. And so this was an entire session about different people that are studying this. And so you have a lot of people who are, and Ben and I kind of talked about this yesterday, but there's a lot of these spooky things that are very written off by kind of traditional materialist science. And you have a lot of these people in this conscious conference saying, listen, like, we're not going to speculate on necessarily, well, a lot of people would speculate, but a lot of the academics are like, we're not going to speculate on like why we think this is happening. Is there some soul? Is there some like place that you should be going after? Is this like healing your wound so that you can reach the afterlife? We're not going to speculate on that, but we are going to try and gather data about this thing that seems very common. So this slide that I have up now is
So by the way, before you continue the talk, yesterday that you referenced. We're not going to post that. We had technical difficulties, but I can catch up everyone on what happened, which was that DR revealed that he is now full woo. He's opened his heart and soul and mind to woo, and it's just flowing through him now.
I will say, okay, so I read this book, and maybe we'll do another episode where we can dig into this more, called An End to Upside Down Thinking. And he talks in there a bunch about, and by the way, I went to another session, which we'll get to this when we talk about day 2 or day 3. But I went to another session about, and they call them ECEs or EXEs, like extra human experiences or something like that. And they were talking about all the same stuff. And there's a lot of people here that are studying all this stuff too. So we're talking about stuff like telepathy, remote viewing / clairvoyance, predicting the future. And you have stuff like humans in controlled trials very like consistently, although not very like in a consistent way, but not a very extreme way. They seem to be able to sort of do better than chance at some of these things. So like moving the needle on a random number generator, or being able to predict what an image that someone saw when they were out of the room. And we're talking about like a few percentage points, but that it's replicated really consistently. Yeah, I think that what we're seeing here is, and in that book, this guy speculates very heavily on why that is, which is like we have eternal souls and yada yada, right? But I think that these phenomena can be interesting and say something about conscious experience, even if it's just that people seem to report them so often. So one of this seems to be like a very commonly reported experience. That by itself is an interesting phenomenon of consciousness, right?
Yeah. So we both read a book, Sentience, by Nick Humphreys. In fact, we discovered him from the last conference. He's really great. It takes like an evolutionary perspective that evolution need to invent consciousness or sentience. More specifically, he, in his younger years, followed around some paranormal scientists and things like that, and he got some flack from his colleagues, but he said, hey, this is sort of a core human thing that I am very curious why people are so inclined to believe in ghosts. So from that meta aspect, I'm also very curious. I'm going to engage with this book. I'm going to read it in a very antagonistic fashion and come up with amazing rebuttals to
which is
all
exactly
these
what I
cool
did.
things.
I'm excited for you to read my review that I'm writing. It's almost done. That's like it's the most notes I've ever taken on a book of like a rebuttal of all these things. But I found the data itself about the consistency of some of the reporting of these phenomena is kind of interesting. So anyway, we're looking at an image from this terminal lucidity one, and this is a patient who has basically like no cortex of their brain, and yet they have a verbal IQ of 140, performance IQ of 112, global IQ of 130. So there's like, one of the things that people sort of contend and is that how are we seeing people that have these really diminished brain capacities that can somehow at certain points seem to exhibit like consciousness that is beyond that? One of the disingenuous analogies that people often make, like in the book, he's like, oh, you would expect more brain activity when people take psychedelics, but you actually see less. And I think that's like quite disingenuous. Like what you see when psychedelics is less local activity and more cross-regional activity. So you're getting more activation of things in different parts. It's like different activation. It's not less activation. Like,
Well, it's less activation in a very specific part, right?
Yeah.
That is sort of the filter.
So I think studying these things is worthwhile and interesting, even if just to sort of pull some of this stuff apart. This is just about the duration of terminal lucidity. It's like, so they did. This woman is doing Marjorie. I'm not going to say her name because I'm going to butcher it. But she's doing a study of like healthcare workers who have observed these experiences, and then she's like kind of like trying to understand the ergonomics of what a terminal lucidity thing.
So
is like.
Is this like in any way related? So I've seen videos of late stage Alzheimer's patients, and they'll play a song for them, some golden oldie, and then the person will perk up and then they'll beautifully sing the song and know all the lyrics, and then a second later they're just gone. Is
I
that
don't
the kind of
I
is
don't
that a
think so.
similar kind of thing?
Generally, this feels to the family like a return to form. Like they're getting better. So often these healthcare workers that have seen this a bunch of times, like hospice people, people will be like, "Oh my God, he's doing so much better. Maybe we're gonna go home," and they're like, "Actually, this might be, you know, you might only have a day or two left," kind of thing. Um, so. So yeah, I don't know. I'd be interested to see if more of this kind of work comes out and people start to get their hands around.
This also makes me wonder. Again, it's this. There's been a line of work. There was a research paper that said like every result is statistically speaking is wrong in any published paper, and it's some sort of title like that. But the idea was that because we don't report negative results, the Bayesian statistics would just show, because of p-hacking and whatnot, that most everything that showed some sort of correlation was just by chance. And
he
kind of
addresses
makes me
this
wonder,
very specifically, by the way, in the book, just for.
oh really? So, but this also kind of makes me wonder, like, people getting better and then dying, that's a memorable thing. People getting worse and dying, that's the expected thing. That's going to happen many times, and you don't sort of log it away. And so maybe it's just very salient in people's memories, like, oh, this person was really getting better for the last week of their life, and then kaput. It makes me wonder if it can be explained away in terms of cognitive biases of the way that these things are recorded.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's not like the descriptions of these isn't like, it's usually like, what was the average? Typically it was they were almost all less than a day, sometimes less than a few minutes. Right. The biggest one was more than a minute, but less than 10 minutes. So this like brief window of engage, and this is a very small study, but she's sort of like trying to build this archive of from healthcare workers to get them to report it. So there's obviously bias too in her reporting, where she said none of the people responded saying that they were religious, but all of them said that they were spiritual. So you have this kind of like baked in bias. Yeah. All right.
Well, wait. So is the idea that how is this terminal lucidity connected to like any sort of spiritual or afterlife concept? Is it that these people think that? Yeah, I'm having trouble connecting those concepts.
So there's that she talked about a few different characteristics of them. One of them being so people will like what do they do when they have this terminal lucidity? One of the things is they want to thank the people that have been helping them. So they'll like talk to the nurses and be like, "This is really you were really kind, and I appreciate that." And then one of them is sort of like they're kind of having engagement with like family members or something. They want to say goodbye to someone, so just classic stuff. So I think they don't fit neatly into any one religious tradition, but I think they fit neatly into like a generic idea of like the soul and life after death, etc.
I see.
Okay, so the next thing that I went to, and I only got in there for a few minutes, but I think it'll be an interesting tip off to some stuff we may address later in episodes. But I went to Stuart Hameroff's session, which was by accident. I forget what I was trying to go to, and I wandered in, and it was like, oh, okay, I've only got a few minutes left. I'll sit into the end of this. And he was talking about his quantum consciousness stuff. So let me just steel man his theory briefly, right? So and I'm not going to try and call this the Orco-R theory, which is because I'll probably butcher it if I try to go too deep here. But they love this idea of like quantum collapse being requiring an observer. And so somehow that needs to be responsible for consciousness. And so the place that they see where quantum events can happen in a cell are these like microtubules in the cell wall. Is this sounding right to you, Ben?
It's been a year since
I've thought
about these.
I think we're both like, we're much more dismissive of it in the past. I mean, I'm still, whatever.
One thing I want to ask, so you already mentioned collapse. is this entire thing contingent on the like Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics, like where you have observer collapsing the wave function? Like,
Yes, I think so.
okay, that actually, I kind of like that, or at least if it's testable, right? Because one issue we have with the interpretations of quantum physics is that it's very hard to craft tests that would say, aha, we're definitely in a mini version of, it's they're all interpretations because there's lack of experimentation that would invalidate any of them, and you have to do things like appeal to Occam's razor and stuff. And so if it is the case that this Hameroff Penrose theory is only valid under the Copenhagen interpretation, then experiments verifying it could get rid of the multiverse many worlds interpretation, and that's kind of exciting to me. I like that. That seems scientific, at least, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that he has been, so Hameroff is an anesthesiologist, and so one of the things that they're investigating, so there's a lot of steam now around these electromagnetic field ideas around consciousness, which, the brain, for 100 years, we've known that the brain produces very specific kinds of waves, right? And that these waves, and we're talking about, beta waves, gamma waves, delta waves, and these waves, kind of work like an FM stereo, where they're sort of sending signals in different directions, and they have like a symbiotic relationship with neurons, where the neuron fires and it sort of starts to generate some of this field, and then the fields that are generated kind of like connect to the waves. So if you go down to this like microscopic scale, the theory is that there's waves that are being produced at this like quantum scale that anesthesia and all these different classes of anesthetics very specifically disrupt. And he actually showed some different anesthetic type things that didn't disrupt these like wavelengths, and they kind of like worked as predicted to sort of to the greater and lesser extent of their anesthetic effect. So yeah, I mean, I would say one of the themes of this round seems to be, if you think of this like these layers of engagement that are maybe conscious at some level, in the way that like a single cell, an amoeba is sort of making some decisions, quote unquote, around how it engages with its environment and when to divide and all of those things, right? That maybe does have sort of like a quote unquote conscious field, right? But to me, it feels very far-fetched to sort of posit that the entire spooky experience that a human is experiencing is all just quantum effects. Like, we went to that one last year. Do you remember that like quantum biology one? And I was trying to remember some of the details of it, but one of the things he was kind of showing that is like, these quantum effects, if anything, seem to go against some of the quantum biology arguments seem to go against ORCOR's main contention, and that if anything, the body is resisting some of these quantum effects when it comes to like DNA.
That's right.
division.
Yeah, the argument was basically like evolution would not favor these like stochastic things, right? Because it'd be hard to sort of grab onto them and make progress.
Yeah.
So if you can suppress this inherent randomness of quantum effects, now you can get going, right? You can actually build something.
So if I were to try and like make I think with some of these like sort of spooky spiritual consciousness descriptions, sometimes people don't say there's a quiet part that they don't say out loud, right? Which is like, well, we don't know, but this is like, it's like, but like, look at quantum and look how it works, and look at this and look. So it's like, okay, so what you're saying is that there is. So if I were to try and describe this the way I think that they would say that you're describing, it's like, okay, great, you have these quantum effects that are maybe having this impact on certain parts of your psyche, right? Maybe it's having an impact on your cells in your body, whatever it is, and that somehow the sort of quantumness of the fields in your cells are getting entangled with this larger quantum field of and I don't even know what a quantum field is. I'm making shit up now.
It's all good.
There's
Sorry,
this like larger. Yeah, and somehow there's like some communication there, and that maybe even that field, that field of consciousness can move outside of your body, and you could, that's another big one that these guys talk about, right? Which is sort of out of body experiences, right? Oh, so this non-local nature of consciousness. So anyway, but as you said, Ben, in the past, like what Sean Carl would say, we know the dynamics and the sort of extent of some of these like quantum things. So, okay, entanglement exists. This like observer effect, this Copenhagen interpretation observer effect exists. So, but how does that communication still happen? There still has to be data that goes back and forth. And it's also like, these remote viewer, the terminal lucidity cases, it's like, okay, great. Well, this guy has no cortex and he's still smart. But if Phineas Gage loses a big chunk of his cortex to a pipe, suddenly he starts, making sexual jokes and swearing and losing his job, right? Like, so that is not true for most people. So obviously your brain does have a really big impact.
Yeah, I guess what I want to know is, I think this is, I think Graziano in one of his earlier books sort of talks about this, about the sort of the magic trick. Like, people want to know what the magic is. But we know, like, when a magician shows you the trick, the magic is actually dispelled. There's no magic, right? And I think people want to hold on to this sort of like spookiness that explains away why the redness of an apple feels so weirdly, intangibly qualitative, right, in a subjective way. So, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that. I like that it's grounded in physics, sort of. But at the end of the day, you have an opinion about the qualia that you experience, the redness of the apple, and you need to obtain that opinion through neurons firing. It's just information, right? That opinion is stored as information in your brain. So at some point, consciousness has to do some work. And so I actually think many of these quantum theories, at least insofar as they're couched in physical processes, sure, like there's some weird quantum shit happening deep down in these neurons at these unimaginably tiny scales, and it's changing brain firing such that you now have this opinion about the redness of the apple. So from that perspective, I kind of think these are more well-grounded, at least, than like certain types of panpsychism, where it's just this spooky specter that's like hovering over your head and somehow giving you the opinion that you have consciousness, even though it has no direct influence on any particles in your brain. But that all being said, I do think the quantum stuff to me is still not super compelling. Obviously, I'm not a physicist, but the physicists I most admire, for example, Sean Carroll says, show me the equations. I've got my equations, and if you're going to try to throw out all of what we know about physics, let me see your equations.
And they're working on it. Like, I would say the Hameroff stuff that quantum stuff doesn't necessarily violate any laws of physics. I think that some of these other ones, like the paper that I showed you, that stuff is positing. And there's another talk we'll talk about eventually, the Donald Hoffman talk about, where he wants, they're working on a more fundamental theory that, is sort of like that the conscious layer is kind of welds together classical and quantum physics. Okay, well, we just got a few minutes left. Let's do let's talk about the IIT session. So the evening was 3 hours of integrated information
theory.
Of
hours.
So I think, was it earlier this year or was it last year when that IIT paper came out?
The one that was like IIT as pseudoscience, and it was 150 author co-signed paper, which, we've talked about this. I think we're in agreement. It's kind of a bad look, even if IIT is pseudoscience. Why you got to throw that out there? Like, people are saying, I don't think Tononi is doing this in bad faith. I don't think he's disingenuous in any way. So to me, it's just kind of, it was a really bad look that almost made IIT look better in comparison. Did the opposite, I think, of what they were intending.
And I think the whole reason that they were at this conference was because of that paper. And because my guess is that they were maybe like, we've had these conversations with people in the conscious community. We're just keeping to do our research, whatever. And that they're like, oh shit, we actually need to talk to some people and make sure they're still on our team. And honestly, this is the most compelled I've been by any IIT stuff. I thought the presentation was really good. Tononi is like an incredibly compelling and charismatic speaker. And the other people that presented, for the most part, were as well. So I'll share a couple things, for sake of time here. The big thing for those who are not familiar with integrated information theory, like it's worth looking up and reading about it. It's a physicalist theory. It exists inside the brain, and what it's claiming is that the things that are integrated are conscious by default. So let me show this, a couple graphics here. So he showed this, and it's like these are kind of hard to see. This was taken on my iPad, but so this is the classic information processing where there's all these processes floating around. So it's like somebody's worried about their house. There's a dangerous thing. There's a house fire. There's a location. They're worried about their cat. And that all these little messages going back and forth are, the sum of that is consciousness. And I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of how I feel about it. And then IIT is this like, no, it's this like gestalt thing that is all of these things taken together. And this is kind of the starting point.
Am I looking at like a...
Don't even ask. Some of these diagrams are so bad.
Is it like a watercolor?
A foggy cloud.
Or did they spill a drink on a figure and
I think
ink is bleeding?
I think so. It's this. Generally, what they do is they have this like cloud of connections. So it's just a bunch of different like cross-connecting nodes, and I think that the photo just destroyed that. So I think these are actually like little lines, and it looks like a fuzzy thing. Yeah. So some of the stuff that they presented in, this is an image of Christoph Koch, who was the best dressed of the thing he's wearing. And
it's an impeccable vibe. He looks barefoot, but I think he's wearing flip-flops. He's
wearing flip-flops, yeah.
One color, and that color is phenomenal on him. It's like a bright mustard. I would call that hoodie, slacks.
So there was this woman, Melanie Boley, I think is her name. Who's a doctor who now works with these guys, and they're studying. They're doing these specific studies around looking at meditators. So one of the contentions of IIT is that they're trying to describe "quote unquote" pure experience. So when you're not experiencing anything, when you've been in this like deep meditative state, and you can experience you, but there's no content to that. And they showed some of these brain scans. So IIT's contention, which I hadn't really heard this before, maybe this has always been what they were saying, but they're saying it's in the back of the brain is where the way the neurons are kind of interwoven with all the sensory data, the sensory information. That's where this would have to happen. And so they showed these scans where it shows this kind of like high level of activation, but no activity, if that makes sense. So I thought that was kind of compelling. And then I will show this, even though this is hard to read as well. I switched part of the way I was taking pictures with my iPad so that I could throw them in my notes app, and it's just like the resolution.
That pure experience, by the way, reminds me of something we learned last year, or at least I learned, the Avicenna floating man.
Yeah, the flying man.
Which is essentially is like put someone in a the modern version of this would be like put someone in a sensory deprivation tank, and then like pump them full of like ketamine, I guess. Is there a point where you just have consciousness with no sensation or perception like can you strip away everything and then is there anything left? And if so, what is that thing? Is that pure consciousness?
So by the way, someone told me that some rando that I met was like, yeah, I've actually been in a sensory maximization tank.
Burning Man.
And it's like flashing images and like all these like crazy things. I was like, that's pretty wild. Anyway, so this graphic, This is a bunch of, so this is the PCI index. We talked about this before, but this is like the zap and zip where you're kind of measuring some of the complexity of a brain. So this is like kind of an outcome of IIT, but I think it's also kind of an outcome of some other theories of consciousness, actually, to sort of measure. And so they have these different states. I'm getting a little bit of weird feedback, but hopefully that's going to go away. There's these different states. So we've got NREM sleep. There's xenon. I think this is propofol. So you have all these classic anesthetics, and they're sort of below this line of consciousness. And then you have these other conscious states. So REM sleep, ketamine, waking time, and those are all above this line. So the goal, and they're kind of, apparently they're seeking FDA approval for this, is to be able to measure consciousness through this device, and to have it this, so that if people are in vegetative state, they can essentially like decide whether they're, in this like unconscious kind of NREM-y propofol state, and that's all they have.
That's
or
incredible.
There's actually something.
I
going
think
on there, and they
the
just can't communicate.
Let's maybe for a minute talk about the zap and zip. I learned about this from Anil Seth's book, Being You, where and I think he had a hand in some of the exact stuff that you're showing, but
yeah,
you apply some sort of current to someone's brain or a stimulus of some sort, and then you literally look at how zippable it is, like WinZip. Like how compressible is it with digital technology, right? And that gives you the compressibility is, I guess, an indirect measure for the complexity of the brain activity, and that has some correlation to consciousness. Which, by the way, it occurred to me there's a recent paper that is pretty popular in the AI research community called "Language Modeling as Compression" at the ICLR 2024 conference, and it kind of, I mean, it's interesting. I don't want to go off the rails too much here, but they're basically showing that the autoregressive next token prediction equations that the main loss for training a large language model is exactly analogous to a type of compression loss. And so what are language models doing? They're compressing the information. They're essentially trying to, like in a sort of a, Shannon information sort of thing, which I think I saw that word floating below with the IIT slide that you showed. And so it is kind of interesting because there's definitely a very deep connection between compression, intelligence, and consciousness as a sort of consciousness meter to try to figure out locked-in syndrome and things like that. It makes a lot of sense to me. But it also makes me wonder if there's a bridge here. Like if compression is sort of the underlying thing, right? Maybe that gives us interesting things to say also about the state of AI consciousness. But that's a whole nother podcast, which we've kind of already had.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's
Thanks,
maybe call it there for day one of the Science of Consciousness conference. Thanks, Ben, for joining me. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'd love to hear from you if you want to leave us some comments on YouTube. Thanks.